You're listening to the We Are Libertarians podcast network. Find all of our shows at wearelibertarians.com.
Okay, if you have not heard about Cash App, you're gonna love me. You want more from all these free apps used for just free and fast money transfers, right? Well, I've got the hookup for you. The Cash App. The Cash App card is a free Visa debit card that lets you use your Cash App balance to pay online and in stores. It's also the only way to get boosts. Now, let me tell you about boosts because it's exclusive to Cash App. Boosts are reusable instant discounts that work at places you actually go to, everywhere from Starbucks to Walmart to even the PlayStation Network store. You can do so much more than buy and save money with this. You can even purchase shares of stock in companies you love by investing as little as $1. Banking is also made easy. With Cash App, you can directly deposit paychecks, tax returns, and more to your Cash App balance using the unique account and routing numbers. And if you don't think things can get any cooler, it does by allowing you to buy and sell Bitcoin, the money of the future. Selling and receiving money on Cash App is as easy as entering a phone number, using another user's name, or simply scanning a QR code. Hit the special link in the show notes and get $5 just for signing up. That is, use that link in the show notes and get $5 just for signing up. So go ahead and hit that link in the show notes and get set up with Cash App today.
Prepare yourself. You're on the run with Remso W. Martinez.
Awesome. Well, everything worked out. The internet is alive. Doug, thank you for taking the time to join us tonight. I've got to ask, what came first for you, journalism or comic books? Because typically you see people really take an interest in both things, but then they dive into one completely and abandon the other. You have been able to really do both the last couple of years. I mean, for most of your career, and over the last couple of years, I know that you were working on your graphic novel Soulfinder, which is coming out with a sequel in the upcoming future. How did all this kind of start?
Yeah, thanks for having me, man. I really appreciate it. So, long story short, I mean, I've loved comics since I was a little kid. I always tell people that my oldest brother would put me on this ugly green chair when I was a kid, and I'd basically sit on his lap, and he would read Spider-Man comics to me. And then for most of my life, even like I would say like around middle school, I got into creative writing. I was in a program where they would bus a couple kids from the middle school to the high school for a writing program, and then I continued that into high school. And then after I got out of the military and I went to the University of Southern California, I was an English major, and I was in all sorts of creative writing classes. So fiction has always been my love, but along the line, for various reasons, I ended up writing and reporting and interviewing people with the Washington Times. But again, I was always drawn back to comic books, and it was something that I reviewed comic books in my spare time. And then at some point in time, meeting other people, other artists, other colorists, everything sort of just came together with Soulfinder Demons Match.
That's awesome. I know that, I think it's fair to say that almost every journalist out there has had the idea of writing a book or a screenplay at one point. I've met a few other folks that want to go ahead and write comics, but it always seems like they're always working on it, although there's not a lot of progress being made. And for some folks, I learned this while writing and self-publishing both of my books. My first one was a bestseller. My second one did all right sales-wise before the pandemic decided to kill that situation. But, a lot of people don't realize that there are options out there, that you don't need to go ahead and wait for somebody to give you permission to publish a book or give you permission to go ahead and try and get that screenplay out there. With comics, it's really something that a lot more people are doing so now, but it's always been really part of comic book culture. Dark Horse Comics, Image, those were just independent groups that were founded by artists and writers that wanted to go out and really do their own thing. So when you decided to go with Soulfinder, did you want to go ahead and publish it yourself, or was it something that you decided, hey, I might throw it around to these different places, but ultimately I want to have creative control over what I do?
Well, ideally, I mean, the little kid inside me always wanted to be inside a comic book shop. And so you have your own comic book next to Spider-Man, or literally write Spider-Man. That's like the dream when you're a kid, or Captain America, or Iron Man, or any of those. So I was very open to the idea of getting into a comic shop, but if you get with a distributor, they're going to want to take a cut, and it gets into all that sort of stuff. But my artist, Timothy Lim, he has a relationship with Antarctic Press, which is like an independent publisher based in Texas. So I was going to essentially say, like, hey, if you guys want to publish this under an AP imprint, fine, go with it. And if they didn't, then I was like, well, I don't care. Then I don't need to give them a cut of anything. I could just sell it direct to my customers that I've cultivated on YouTube and Twitter and all these different social media platforms. So it's a win-win for me. And then on a long enough timeline, you could still get into comic shops. So this past weekend, a local comic shop here in Sparks, Nevada, where I am, they ordered copies of Soulfinder. The guy was looking at it. I have a Dave Dorman cover. Anyone who's been into comics a long time, they know Dave Dorman did a lot of the Star Wars stuff in the 90s. It's basically iconic in that sense. And so we just ordered them. So it's one of those things where, yeah, it'd be nice if Image picked it up or something like that, but I'm not going to get bent out of shape if it doesn't happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's a lot of freedom that you get owning your creation outright that a lot of people miss once they typically go with one of these publishers. And I mean, in terms of writing, that was one thing that I wanted to maintain. It was, I wanted to make sure that what's in my manuscript, while I'll definitely hire out editors to go ahead and give me their opinion on things, and I might change some things here and there between now and publishing, ultimately I want to make sure that what's in my book is what readers are going to read. And I know more than enough people that, you know, while they're happy that they may have gone with like a Regnery or a Penguin House, or Penguin Books or Random House or whatever, they always say that they had to sacrifice a lot of their editorial control in the process. And that's just something I wasn't willing to do. But, you know, you mentioned that a lot of people are worried that if they go the independent route, they might not be in stores. I mean, you just brought up the fact that a comic book store is willing to go ahead and pick up your stuff. My second book right now, and like the first one, it's in stores throughout Northern Virginia and Washington, D.C. Is it across the country? No, but I know at least a dozen bookstores where I can go and see my book on the shelf, and it gives me that pride as a writer. So even though I had to do a little bit more work, even though it's not everywhere, at the same time, it's not like it wasn't something I couldn't do. And I think a lot of people are intimidated by the process of it itself. What were some of the challenges you faced as you were, you know, producing and creating your comic?
So probably the hardest thing for people, especially if they want to get into comic books, is finding an artist that you could rely on. And I mean, making comics is kind of pricey. If you actually want to put out a good product and you want to put it out on time, a lot of people, they don't crunch the numbers beforehand, and then they get into it, and then all of a sudden they're like, oh boy, this is getting really expensive in terms of the printing costs, paying the artist, paying the colorist, paying the letterer. If you hire someone to do the distribution for you, if you get into international, all that stuff starts to add up. But if you're a writer, you have to convince an artist to believe in your vision and your story. And so that's difficult for a lot of people that I talk to, but I lucked out in that my artist, we actually just became friends due to we're of the same, we're both practicing Catholics, and we're both generally conservative guys. So we actually struck up a friendship on those sorts of issues, and then it just sort of naturally led into working together on a comic book. So I was very blessed in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, the expenses alone, I think that's one of the biggest barriers for a lot of people, because, you know, once you decide that this is the route you want to go, it becomes a very daunting challenge for people. I tell people this quite often, but, you know, one of the things I had to do when I decided that for my first book, I was going to go ahead and self-publish it, I took a part-time job as a security guard. So I was a security guard by night, and all that money was going straight into producing my first book. And by day, I was still a freelance reporter. I was reporting as the DC correspondent for a few websites out in California. So it's like I had my job to pay my bills, and I had to take on a completely separate job, which really sucked. I mean, on my first day, a couple of kids actually lit a dumpster on fire. So when people say they had a job that was a dumpster fire, I can literally say that job was a literal and figurative dumpster fire. But I mean, that was one of those things I had to do, and I was making really shit money doing both. But actually getting to see my book come out, and I was actually able to hire a publicist with it. She worked her heart out, did a great job. Eventually I made the money back. That's one thing that a lot of people, don't get to say. So I was really happy about that. So now I get that royalty check from Amazon, and I'm pretty fulfilled as is. But I mean, it's just one of those things that when you realize that this is what you want to do, it's the actual, acting upon it, which is where a lot of people just don't pull through. So I'm wondering, when you finally actually got to see and hold your comic, smell it even, what was that feeling like, knowing that you actually did it and now you can actually get it in front of readers?
Yeah, I mean, there certainly was a cathartic release at some point in time where you put so much time and effort into it. Like you said, you had your normal job, and then you have a night job, and you're like finding a way to make this dream a reality. And so with the comic book, then it's like you have this, the page layouts, and then the pencils, and then the inks, and then the color work, and then the lettering comes on, and then you got to get it printed, and then you have issues with the printer. So for like Soulfinder, on our cover, there was like a gold foil sort of issue where we were about to go out and mail everything, and like right towards the end, there was like a printer snafu, and the gold foil was coming off on the back. As they were printing together, it was like coming off, and they had to redo everything. So it's like all the way up until the very last step, you're never in the clear. And then so finally we gave enough leeway for those sorts of issues to happen, so we would still publish on time. But just to finally get it and to know how much goes into it's, I was telling my artist, Timothy Lim, it's like a minor miracle that any sort of collaborative project actually comes to fruition. And this is just a comic. Like, imagine a movie with the size of the cast and all the extras and the sound guys. It's very humbling experience.
No, absolutely. And I mean, with something like this, because you're involved in almost every process of it, I mean, it brings on a type of stress that a lot of people who have gone more mainstream, they understand it, but unless they've actually had to live it, they don't really feel a lot of the stress that really is part of it. And I mean, for me, I look at my first book, and I know all the mistakes. There are some things that people, if they really looked into it, they know, this could be better. Oh, why is this there? Whether it's the print or the feeling of the book, there's always something. But I mean, luckily I was able to go ahead and learn how to do better for my second book because I had already made the mistakes. But I mean, it only motivated me to want to do more. But enough about the process. I mean, this is what I'm really excited to talk about. You sent me the first Soulfinder several months ago, and right off the bat, when I learned what the comic was about, I was already hooked before you sent it to me. Growing up, and we've talked about this enough, chatting back and forth. I'm as big as a nerd as they come. I mean, right now around my studio, I've got an Avengers Endgame poster, and I've got a signed Venom lithograph right next to me and an Adam West statue. So that's enough for most people to see. But I've always been drawn to really two things. One is the paranormal and the supernatural, and the other was, seeing that in comics. So, Hellstrom, Son of Satan, a lot of John Constantine Hellblazer. That was what I read a lot of, especially my first year in the Army. I just ate that stuff up constantly. So for people that don't know about Soulfinder, can you kind of give them a quick synopsis of what the story's about?
Sure. Long story short, it's about combat veterans that that get out, become priests and exorcists, and then they're recruited into a major order of exorcists called Soulfinders. And essentially, the only way that you could get recruited is you have to have seen the horrors of war and come out with your faith intact, because the level of evil that they're taking on is it's not even something that most priests or other exorcists can fathom. It's just like a level above that. And so having gone through war and maybe even been physically scarred, like the main character in this book, Father Redder, is like literally scarred. He doesn't even have his left leg. He's like a partial amputee. But he still has his faith in God. So he's the guy that they're going to recruit for this. And this is the tale of his essentially origin story.
I mean, it's when I was reading it, for a lot of people, they can connect to certain characters. For this one, it really struck a chord with me because, I mean, for one, it's a comic, so of course I'm gonna really love it immediately. But I mean, just in terms of the characters, I don't often talk about it because I don't really feel like many people are interested. But I mean, I was baptized Catholic as a child, and around the time that I hit high school, I was pretty much an atheist. It wasn't until I joined the military and I had this chaplain, Randall, who just completely took an interest in me and was willing to, sit down with me as I was going through some rather difficult times, and not only be there as a fellow soldier and as a leader, but also as a spiritual mentor. He really helped me, understand my worldview and develop my faith. And since then, I mean, my life hasn't been the same, but ultimately it's been better for that. But through that, I mean, I had my doubts about certain things. It wasn't really until I got into the paranormal with my brother. We actually formed our own paranormal investigation team called Argos Paranormal. And eventually we started our television series, The Witching Hour, which, folks, you can go ahead and find more about that on argosparanormal.com. Season 2 is out by the time you're listening to this. Experiencing that side of the world, it solidified a lot of things for me. I am just curious, was this all just something you were interested in, or what's your personal take on the topics discussed in the comic? Because, I mean, for a lot of Catholics that I know, when I talk to them about, the paranormal and of supernatural phenomenon, it's kind of a mixed bag. Ironically, when it comes to the existence of demons and things like that, of course, we see it all over the place in pop culture. But when you actually talk to a lot of Catholics and other Christians, they don't really seem to see it as a thing. So what's kind of like your own personal relationship with the topics discussed in the story?
Yeah. So, well, in terms of supernatural, I've personally had a lot of supernatural things happen to me over the course of my life. So even at a young age, I believe that I was essentially saved by my guardian angel. I should have been hit by a car, and there was something like a physical force that essentially grabbed me and stopped me, because I didn't see the car, but I remember being physically, like, it just felt like something just pulled me and stopped me, and where I would have been hit by this car. So at a young age, I essentially determined, I was like, that had to have been my guardian angel. Guardian angels are real.
That's crazy.
And so since that time, I've always been into angels. When I went into the military, my mom gave me a Saint Michael pendant that I always had with me all the time. So I've always loved Saint Michael. And I did drift away a little bit in some respects from my faith when I was in the military, but not completely, if that makes sense. So I wasn't attending mass on a regular basis by any means, but I was still, saying prayers at night. But so there's always been that supernatural element to it. And then just through some, we'll just say, some issues with some family members. I got to be careful how I say this, but there are some individuals that I believe that have been acted on by demons. And so that also prompted me to sort of look into exorcisms, and the topic in general. And so at some point in time, I just sort of became, I don't want to say an expert by any means, but in terms of my group of friends, I suppose that I know a lot more about exorcists than a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those topics that unless you study it for years and years and years, it's something that where you're always going to find new information about. When I first started, investigating the paranormal, I initially started as a skeptic. I was doing an indie docuseries called Haunted Republic. It was a spinoff of an old podcast I had. And really, it was one of those things where I was doing it just so I could disprove things, and documented through the show. I had a change in worldview. You can't say that when things are happening that you can't find a logical explanation for, that you're not willing to at least be open-minded. And over the years, I've definitely had more of an evolution on that. I don't know if you've ever read his book, but Ralph Sarchi was a New York Police Department officer. And in his book, Deliver Us from Evil, he basically talks about how he went from a skeptic to being one of the first non-ordained demonologists after that of Ed Warren, of the Ed and Lorraine Warren, The Conjuring fame. Ed Warren was probably, I think he was the first non-ordained exorcist by the Catholic Church. And hearing stories like that really gave me an insight, because here you have people who, they have a very dangerous job. Their reputation really does, it might be affected by the stuff they're doing, but they're willing to go out and speak about it. And in your book, in your comic, even though it's a fictional story, there were a lot of things in there that I was able to pick up as, oh my God, he did his homework on some of this.
Yeah, one of the coolest things about the book is afterwards, I was actually contacted by multiple priests and a deacon, and they were like, hey, I was really surprised. This is like rooted in the theology behind it is it's sound. It's obviously fiction, and certain things you play up and you build upon the faith, but you're not saying anything heretical at all. And so I was like, yeah, no, I'm a practicing Catholic. So is my artist. And I went to two other guys that are Catholic, and I was like, can you just make sure everything is sound here before? I don't want to publish this and then have priests chewing me out afterwards. And so that was pretty cool to actually get emails from priests that were happy, and they're like, can I order some for Christmas presents? And I was like, sure, yeah, I'll just send them to you for free. So my policy is if a priest or a deacon wants extra copies, then they get them for free.
Oh, that's awesome. It's it's one of those things where you really have to find this balance between being honest to the sources of which you're getting a lot of this inspiration and knowledge from, but also writing and portraying the story in a way which is also entertaining. What was it kind of like balancing between that line between I want to be faithful to everything that's inspiring what I'm writing about, but at the same time, I also want to just write a good comic book?
Right. So first and foremost, especially with my history in terms of my criticism of the mainstream industry in Marvel and DC, I just wanted to tell a really fun, solid story. And I wanted to make sure that I wasn't beating anyone over the head and saying, like, if you're not a Catholic, then you're a bad person, or that sort of thing. And so it was just, okay, how do I tell a tale that's sort of like Indiana Jones has a lot of, it's got these religious elements in it, and there's stuff with the Catholic Church, but it builds this fictional world on top of all of it. That's actually, there's a reality to it. And so I wanted to, how do I say this? I guess I should go to one of the people that promoted it the most is actually an atheist. He has a really huge YouTube channel. He goes by Just Some Guy. And he really, really liked the book a lot. And he brought in thousands of dollars worth of sales. And I was like, that is so cool that an atheist is like, no, this is a really good book. Yeah, he's a Catholic dude. But at no point in time did I feel as though he was weirdly preaching to me at all. It was just a good story.
I think it's really important that you note that, because I mean, for a lot of, I'll say for a lot of like conservative entertainment efforts, they've never really been that good. And one example I bring up is Atlas Shrugged. And, you know, for more politically wise people, yeah, they're objectivists. Yeah, it goes into a lot of things. But basically, you know, during the 2012 election, primarily conservatives really adopted Atlas Shrugged and Ayn Rand as their go-to, despite some of Paul Ryan's remarks. But anyway, like the Atlas Shrugged film series, and this is coming as somebody who is a fan of the Fountainhead, has read Atlas Shrugged cover to cover at least twice in 10 years. The films were terrible and should have never ever seen an audience. And this is also some of my criticisms of the Christian film industry. I've had Dallas Jenkins, his father, Jerry Jenkins, wrote the Left Behind series. I loved the Left Behind series as a kid and a teenager. I still think it's a great series, but the Left Behind films with Kirk Cameron and even the recent one of Nick Cage were terrible. It seems like for a lot of openly and strongly Christian conservative creators, a lot of their creations are really just preachy and not good at all.
Yeah, no, and that gets into some awkward situations, and it did for me when I was essentially marketing the book and hearing back from people. There's a certain religious population where they just want to preach to the choir, and it's sort of, I don't want to say it's like Joel Osteen-ish or whatever like that prosperity gospels guy is, but it's like this super feel goody, and we're patting ourselves on the back. And
you're afraid to criticize it because if you criticize them, they might think you're criticizing their faith or something.
Yeah, and it's really strange. And I actually got one email from somebody, and they were like, well, you know, I saw some of your Indiegogo page, and you were showing a little bit of skin there. I don't know if this is this like, can I read this? And he was referencing the second page.
Oh, the hot librarians?
There's the librarian looking, yeah, her name is Charlotte. And we don't have the images up now, but if you saw a picture of her, she's wearing a very conservative outfit, but you could see her forearms. And he was essentially asking me if I had a rated G story on exorcists. And I was just like, well, you know, if showing forearms is a little too much for you, then I think this might not be your cup of tea.
Don't read the next couple pages.
Yeah. And so it's like, I'm trying to reach out to people that are agnostics, that are atheists as well. And I've heard from people where they were just like, yeah, I looked into this book and I saw that, oh, you are actually telling serious, very real Latin prayers of deliverance. And like I said, the theology is actually real. So for people that they only wanted to see giant black python demons go up against a priest, that's fine. But then people that actually were it piqued their interest in terms of, okay, well, let me look. This is a side of the Catholic faith that I've never really seen before. Is this real? And they were in some ways rewarded by going to Google and looking up and seeing like, no, this guy actually, like you said, did his homework.
Yeah, I mean, your comic really hit both sides of me, because as a fan, like I know that there's nothing biblically sound in Hellblazer, but I love John Constantine. So I wanted to be entertained. But as somebody that's also, you know, very much knowledgeable about the paranormal and the occult and certain aspects of demonology, I was just eating it up as well. And I mean, you hit on something important. You want this to be something that will be entertaining and informative to both sides of the audience. That's why with my show, The Witching Hour, it was very hard for me towards the beginning of my I call it my second job, because it really took up more than enough time and money to still be a hobby. But really, I find that what I do as a paranormal investigator is important, especially when I do a lot of private home investigations for people to see what's actually going on. And I when I started, I was just out of Liberty University. So I know that people, when they looked at me, they were going to come to one presupposition or another just based off a little bit of my background.
Mm-hmm.
But I think through the show, what I tried to do was I really tried to balance that line between, am I really showing people the evidence and being objective about it, or am I pontificating too much? And not many people know this, but one of the other cast members of the show, Brian Sujanen, when he first started, I mean, he was a very strong atheist. He just wanted to check it out and see what was going on. And Brian has since shifted to being more agnostic, more open to, things around the world being not what they seem to be, if that makes any sense.
Right.
But I mean, he's very open-minded to it. And I would have never been able to talk to him about things like this if he didn't first just want to get into it for the adventure and the rush of it. So, him beginning to look more into where he stands on certain issues of faith and spirituality, that evolved because he had the initial interest. He wanted to jump in for the fun of it, and then he stayed in because he got more serious of it.
Yeah, it's interesting. To me, it's one of those things where the supernatural keeps happening to people that they don't have any sort of mental illnesses. They have zero reason to lie. They lead productive lives. They have happy families. And yet you hear people that have these supernatural experiences. And so the idea to me that you would just be like, no, you're just hallucinating. And it's just like, no, at some point in time, you would think that like objective observers would be like, okay, well, I've known Doug for 15 years and he's a completely rational, very logical man. And I know that he's of sound mind. So when he tells me of the supernatural experience, I could either just ignore it completely or say like, maybe I should look into this a little bit.
Absolutely. And I mean, I thought continuing to do my show while also working in the newsroom would cause some problems, but I mean, people see how I do things. They know who I am as a person and as a professional. And whether it's folks at the Washington Times or even other people I've met who are at NPR, CNN even, I've never met somebody that was openly hostile to that other side of my life. If anything, even whether you were a staunch Catholic or a staunch atheist, everyone has come to me when they've wanted to talk about this, and there's always that one story. They're like, I don't know how I feel about this, but let me tell you about this one time. Almost everybody has that one time because ultimately, as I believe, we live in a world which is beyond the physical, and there are going to be things that are sometimes unexplainable.
Yeah, and it's funny because, again, after having release Soulfinder, I'll randomly. So like I was in the Philippines earlier this year, and I had somebody come up to me who had heard about the book, and she's just like, "So do you really believe this demon stuff?" And I was like, "Yes, I'm a practicing Catholic." And she's like, "Huh." And then of course it springboards into like, "Okay, well, tell me more." And then you explain yourself, and if you have done any sort of research and you take the subject seriously, then you could kind of see the wheels turning in their head like, oh, okay, this guy isn't crazy. He's not some sort of, I don't know, just like getting high in the desert in New Mexico and looking for aliens or something like that. It's like, no, he actually knows what he's talking about, and this makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, the one I will say, if there's a generalized group of people where I have not necessarily received criticism, because overwhelmingly over the past 5 years I've been doing this, and especially when the show started hitting different networks along the East Coast, the one group that has given me some pushback are people that, frankly, I went to Liberty University with. And for people that have had their head under a rock, I mean, Liberty University is the largest evangelical Christian school in the world. And it is somewhat funny because I don't necessarily see this amongst my friends who are actually practicing Catholics, not the ones that I would consider culturally Catholic, if that makes sense.
Right.
But, there seems to be really kind of a divorce between the idea of supernatural and paranormal activity being real, as in we can actually see it, we can experience it, we believe it's something that's still occurring. And well, that stuff just happened in the Bible. Because my thing is this, I'm sorry to cut you off. Like if you believe in the Bible, if you believe that's true, you have to believe that what people are saying experienced was true to them.
Right. And actually in Soulfinder, there's the Bishop Beige. And that is basically my sort of knock on quote unquote beige Catholicism. So Bishop Barron talks about when he was growing up, there were these ugly, gross churches where everything was beige. And like, you couldn't even tell that it was basically a Catholic church. It was just like late 70s, early 80s. And you have these bishops that are basically like they're heretics. And or you'll meet these random priests and they literally they will say like the devil's a metaphor and strange things like that. And like the Eucharist is like Eucharist is that's just a symbol. It's like, no, you're not Catholic. Like, why are you even in the Catholic Church right now? Like, this is freaking me out. And so like the person who's actually practicing the faith as it has historically been practiced is sometimes, at least these days, actually seen as a weirdo.
It's just so it's so odd. Especially I can name like a dozen people who will straight up tell you, yeah, hell's not real, the devil's not real. It's like that alone. Like, okay, we can argue about whether or not when you're participating in communion, whether or not the bread and wine, or if you're a Methodist like I was, bread and grape juice is actually the body and blood of Christ. We can have an argument about that, and I won't say that you're teaching something or believing something that's just not biblical at all. When you start telling me stuff like the devil's not real, hell's not real, you've got a giant effing problem.
Yeah, and then that gets into conversations where you're like, well, the devil has worked his way into the church, because if you could take out, that gets into Soulfinder as well. If you could take out the shepherd, then the flock becomes easy pickings. And so they want to go after the priest. They want to go after, in this book particularly, they want to go after the Soulfinders. They want to destroy Patrick Redder's faith, because if they could take him off the spiritual chessboard, then they have it's like open season on souls.
It's just the timing of when I read Soulfinder, and even with a lot of stuff going on now, I mean, I've had to really look into my faith and things I believe. And I mean, by the time, I think when you sent a copy for me to read, around that time, that's when the Methodist Church, and I've been a practicing Methodist since I was 18 until very recently. Like around that time, that's when the Methodist Church said, we're just going to split up. So now we're going to be the divorced Methodist Church. So I had a lot of people I know that were Methodists on both the conservative and more progressive side ask, what are you going to do now? And, for them, I said, well, I think I need to go back to, understanding really where we stand on theology and stuff. And since then I've been more so involved in the Anglican tradition, the Anglican Catholic tradition. Mm-hmm. And they're like, well, why did you do that? And I'm like, well, I mean, if you think about it, John Wesley, the man that founded the Methodist movement, he never stopped being an Anglican minister. So maybe he was onto something. But it's understanding this part of Christianity, and it's understanding this part of our history and why we believe what we believe, which is important. I'm not Catholic for reasons which would be an entire episode's worth of stuff. I don't want to get too far off. But at the same time, it's like there's a reason why I often didn't fit in with certain crowds at Liberty University. It's because tradition does matter. When we do communion and, we're about to take it, that is, at least to me, the literal blood and body of Christ. Why? Well, it was real to everyone else that took communion in the New Testament. Why wouldn't it be real to me? Why is it less real? Because Jesus Christ is not in a physical form in front of me. That's one thing where they're like, man, that just doesn't happen. I'm like, really? Then why take communion? If it's just ceremonial, if it's just that, why the hell are we still doing it? Because other than that, it's a waste of time. These things matter more so than just because we can do it. We should do it to remember. That's why for a lot of evangelical criticisms of, Catholicism specifically, they're like, oh, why are there candles? Why are there scents? Why is there so much emphasis on artwork and all this other stuff? It's because, we've always been a visual tradition. This stuff matters. Remember, when the church was being founded, most people couldn't read. So this stuff kind of matters to them so they understand it. And it should matter to us now. And that's the one thing that, in terms of understanding very serious topics like demons, for example, if you look into this stuff without being grounded in your faith, it's going to take you on a freaking roller coaster.
Yeah, and the problem with a lot of people, like I said, like this woman that just approaches me and she's like, do you really believe in this stuff? So I don't want to necessarily liken it to calculus, but with anything, with faith, the Bible, it's like you have people that want you to boil down the entire faith into like a tweet, 140 characters or whatever the heck it is like these days. And you're just like, okay, well, if you have no foundation, and now you're asking me to break down different demonic activity for you in terms of obsession and possession and all these different ways that demons can act upon the physical world and what it actually means and how you've been led astray by Hollywood movies. And it's not usually like 99% of the time, it's not like Hollywood portrays it. You're going to have a tough time because they're just like, all right, break it down for me in 60 seconds or less. And you're just like, okay, well, I don't know how this is going to work, but I'll try my best.
Absolutely. And when it comes to this topic specifically, it's one of those things, like many things, that have been somewhat perverted by popular culture. As somebody who is a staunch Hellblazer fan, John Constantine all the way, Justice League Dark, love all that stuff. I can't tell people if they ask about demons, well, did you ever see Constantine with Keanu Reeves? Did you ever see The Exorcist? Because then at that point, that itself is not truthful. When I think I asked you this a while ago, correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the sources you went to really try and understand demonology was Father Malachi Martin's book.
Oh yeah, I love it.
What for people that don't know, who is Malachi Martin and what was his thing basically?
So he wrote Hostage to the Devil, and essentially that was an examination of, I want to say, I can't remember if it was like 5 or 7. There was a small number of different individuals that are possessed in different ways. And the book itself is a monster. It was turned into a documentary, but don't see that. I heard it was really bad.
I've seen it. It is not... okay, if you're somewhat interested in this stuff and you want to start somewhere, don't start there. Get the book instead.
The book breaks it down in a way where... So how do I say this? I guess I'll liken it to Soulfinder. So there's a demon or demons in Soulfinder called the Limax. It's like this little slug sort of thing. And what I wanted to portray with the Limax is that possession is not something that you just snap your fingers and somebody is possessed. This is something that happens bit by bit. It happens in very small increments where you tell a little lie, you tell another little lie, you tell another little lie. And slowly over the course of time, your will becomes aligned with the father of lies, the prince of lies. And so until essentially your entire being is just essentially evil. And you've given yourself up to the devil. And so most people they read comic books or they see movies, and a demon just jumps from body to body or whatnot, and it's like a light switch. And it's like, no, it's not like that. It's much more methodical. And when you're dealing with demons that are eternal creatures that their intelligence is far beyond any human's intelligence. They're going to find very subtle ways to bring you into alignment with their mode of thinking and being.
And it's a, if you read that book, you're in for something completely else, people. Ralph Sarchi in Deliver Us from Evil, he knew Father Martin, and he was one of the people that was instrumental in him eventually becoming a demonologist. But it's one of those things where I really wish more people who are Christian would try and understand that, because very much so, I think we've divorced ourselves as a community, both Catholic and evangelical, and whatever strain you want to go ahead and throw out there. I think a lot of us in the United States have really drifted from that part of ourselves. And I mean, I know that your intent for the comic was not necessarily to try and preach and convert people, but I've always found two things. One, for me as an individual, I've always found that comedy is the most disarming thing. I always try and make people laugh. I always try and do that because I think that if I can make them laugh, they're more open to what I'm going to say. But even just entertainment itself, that is the one thing that will always open bridges of communication between people who are completely different. And I really do believe that with Soulfinder, I mean, it really hits on both those things. If you're just looking for a good supernatural comic about a guy who's a badass who's going to fight demons, you're going to get it here. But if you're also somebody who's really into the stuff like we are, you're going to find so much in there that you probably didn't even know before you got into it. So for people that are more interested in learning about this stuff, you give them both at the same time. And that's where you succeeded, where a lot of people really don't.
I've always sort of loved Christopher Nolan's movies, and that I think that he does this really good job of writing scripts with his brother where it works on like a spectrum where, again, if you just want to see the action, you'll get the action. But if you want to think about it on a more cerebral level, then you have that. So it's like you got the popcorn movie, but then even his action movies have a little like indie to it. But then he's also working on another sort of spectrum where people that have an intelligence will just say, on the lower end of the intelligence spectrum, like 90, they'll leave the theater and they'll be happy. But then somebody who maybe you could get up into like the 130s or 140s, maybe they'll actually find something that they enjoy as well. And so I wanted to write something that just had these different layers to it. And however deep somebody wants to drill down into it, they would be satisfied.
Absolutely. Well, Doug, we've covered a lot today, but here's the most important thing that people want to know before I let you go. How can they get their hands on the first issue of Soulfinder? And I know you've got the second one, the sequel, coming up very soon.
Yeah, the art is basically done. And then for the second one, which is called Black Tide, and then it'll be going to our colorist soon. So that hopefully that'll be out later this year. But if they wanted Soulfinder Demons Match, they could either email me at douglasernst@douglasernst.blog. That's douglasernst@douglasernst.blog. Or in the very near future, I guess you'll be the first person that I'll tell this to. There's what's called Iconic Comics, which is run by my artist friend, Johnny, who normally puts on Bell County Comic Con in Texas. The pandemic threw that off this year. But anyway, he's got Iconic Comics. And in the very near future, Demons Match will be offered on their website.
Oh, that's going to be awesome. I'm really excited for everything you have going on. Folks, I'm going to go ahead and include everything that Doug mentioned in the show notes. Before you go, where can people reach out? Where can they follow your work and everything else you do?
Oh, thanks, man. I appreciate it. It's just Douglas Ernst on Twitter, and it's verified, so it's me. There's not anyone faking my account, which was a worry in the past. And then on YouTube, it's just Douglas Ernst, and on Instagram, it's just Douglas Ernst as well.
Well, sir, it's been such a pleasure to finally get to pick your brain about all of this stuff, and I'm so excited for everything that you've got coming down the pipe. Thank you again for joining the program.
Thanks, man.
Folks, this is one of those things where I get to talk about everything I love at the same time: comics, religion, pop culture, demons, all thrown into one thing. So I highly recommend you check this out if you're like me and you fit that odd end of the spectrum where all those things just coalesce. But, if you want to keep this conversation going, go ahead and follow me everywhere. You know how Al Gore's amazing internet works. Just find me at Hey Remso, HeyRemso. Almost spelled my own name. What the fuck? You can also find me on Parler. I'm just at Remso. So if you ever see Remso 2 pop up, call that person a loser. As always, you're listening to On the Run. I'm Remso W. Martinez. Good night.
Check out our other shows and more from the We Are Libertarians network at wearelibertarians.com.